everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and today we are going to finish our series on metabolic psychiatry. So this is part 3 of this series. And for this series, we have been going over the first 2 parts of the book, Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind by Dr. Georgia Ede. And what we're focusing on in this series is how to improve brain health through nutrition. So if you've enjoyed what we are talking about during this series, if you've liked this subject and you want to learn more, I'll put my Amazon affiliate link for this book down below in the comment section, and you can grab the book for yourself. There's a lot more details in the book that we're not going over. I'm just trying to give you a foundation, an idea of what this approach is all about. Just like I said in my last 2 videos, this is not medical advice. I'm not a doctor or a health professional. Please consult your primary health practitioner or a doctor trained in a ketogenic diet before making any changes to your diet. Ketogenic diets are extremely powerful, and the more medications you are on, the more carefully you will need to be watched as you begin this journey. Just like my other 2 videos, I'm going to put my favorite resources down below in the comments section, and I'll also have my Amazon affiliate links to some of my favorite health tools down below as well. The book that we are using has 4 parts to it, but we're only going over the first 2 parts. I really just want to frame this new concept for you. And then if you're interested in it, if it captures your attention, you can go ahead and get the rest of the book for yourself and do a deeper dive on it and really learn about how to put this diet into practice. So with that being said, we're going to finish up part 2 of this book, and that's chapters 8 and 9. And this is talking about our descent into dietary madness. And I think a lot of us would agree that our health, our nutrition is not optimal, and that we're seeing a lot of things change in our society. There are a lot of things that seem to be happening with our health that didn't happen 100 years ago. So let's take a deeper dive into that. In chapter 8, we're going to talk about insulin resistance, and she calls this your brain's silent enemy. On page 124, she talks about high insulin and glucose levels. And in this chapter, she defines prediabetes, metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and hyperinsulinemia. And she puts a chart of consequences on page 125 and 126. Some of the consequences of these conditions are fatty liver, obesity, gallbladder, cancer, PCOS, stroke, acne, high blood pressure, cardiac disease. All of those things are linked to high insulin and glucose levels. In fact, one of the greatest risks for heart attack is diabetes, high sugar levels. And for a long time, we've been blaming fat and meat. But we haven't been connecting how sugar affects the heart, how sugar affects all these different issues. And so she's going to talk about that in chapter 8. And she also talks about testing for insulin resistance and how to do that and what that looks like. And I'm not going to focus too much on that today. That's something that you can look into if you want this book. I'll let you look into that on your own. Right now, I just want to give you a little bit of an overview and then dive deeper into what some of the research is saying. Let's talk about Alzheimer's for a moment. She says the little known truth is that scientists now understand a great deal about what lays the groundwork for most cases of Alzheimer's disease. More than enough to confidently conclude that this scourge may be largely preventable. So that's on page 129. And then she says a staggering 81% of people with Alzheimer's disease have insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, a rate twice as high among their cognitively healthy peers. In those of us with persistently high blood glucose levels, the receptors responsible for escorting insulin across the blood-brain barrier can become increasingly resistant to insulin, making it harder for insulin to penetrate the brain. And wouldn't it be interesting to figure out that so much of what we're eating is contributing to these issues? And on page 136, 137, and 138, she starts talking about insulin resistance in terms of pre-mental illness. And she says, signs of insulin resistance are strongly associated with psychiatric disorders. That is to say, people with insulin resistance are much more likely to suffer poor mental health and vice versa. In bipolar disorder, some brain areas process glucose better than others, but overall, there is a reduction in glucose usage compared to people without bipolar disorder. In people with schizophrenia who also have insulin resistance, brain cells process glucose more slowly, causing glucose to accumulate to higher levels inside the brain. Researchers have also detected sluggish brain glucose processing in adults who have ADHD, people with borderline personality disorder, and people with OCD issues. So right here, we're seeing another connection between mental illness and insulin resistance. And it gets even more interesting. On page 139, she talks about reversing insulin resistance and how that affects mental health. And she says, if reversing insulin resistance with a simple diabetes medication helps people with bipolar disorder feel better, it would be reasonable to think that reversing insulin resistance with lifestyle changes could do the same. One of the most effective ways to address insulin resistance is with a ketogenic diet. How exactly will chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, and sluggish brain glucose processing affect your mental health? So that sums up what she talked about on chapter 8. I know I moved through that quickly, but I really just want to give you a taste of what that chapter is about and get you to think about your diet a little bit differently than maybe what traditional science, traditional medicine, and traditional nutrition has told you before. So with that being said, let's go into chapter 9 and talk about the promise of ketogenic diets for mental health. Let's talk about the diet protocol because this is really important. These are the ratios that are typical for a ketogenic diet. That's what helps us get into ketosis. That is what's making the difference between running on glucose and ketones. And when I track my ratios, not everybody does. I'm somebody who likes to track my ratios. I use an app on my phone called Carb Manager, and it is free, but of course you can always pay for upgrades just like every other app, right? But this app helps you track, and there are other ones like it. That's just the one that I use. So Carb Manager is what I use to track my ratios and make sure that I am getting about 15% protein. And I do try to get more towards the 80% fat, but that might not be comfortable for everybody. But another important thing is to really lower those carbohydrates. And when I talk about carbohydrates, I'm including fiber. In the end, you want to include fiber in your carbohydrate total. Really, I don't eat any fiber at all. I haven't eaten fiber in almost 2 years. And I am very minimal with my carbohydrates. Some days I have absolutely zero carbohydrates. And some days, depending on what I eat, things like yogurt and sour cream and eggs do have carbs in them. So you can be on a carnivore diet and still end up eating carbohydrates. But there are many days when I eat zero carbohydrates. One thing to remember about this diet is that if you eat too much protein or too many carbs, that's going to kick you out of ketosis. And that's really the goal for the diet if you're trying to get into ketosis. Now, if you're just trying to lower your carbs, maybe eating more protein works for you, and maybe eating less fat works for you. If your goal is not to be in a high level of ketosis, then you can play with these ratios just a little bit. But just keep in mind, if you're going really heavy on that protein and you're not eating much fat, if you're eating that lean protein, like a lean chicken or a lean turkey, that you may see your glucose levels go a little bit higher, and it might kick you out of ketosis. And if that's your goal, if your goal is to be in ketosis, you will have to watch how much protein you're eating. So for me, I want to be in a higher ratio of fat for myself. That's where I feel the best for myself. And so some of the fats I will snack on throughout the day is butter, fatty red meat. And even though I've been doing carnivore diet, I have started including cocoa butter and olive oil into my diet again because I'm trying to get a little bit wider variety of healthy fats. It's something I'm playing around with right now. And cocoa butter, you can eat dark chocolate, but that's still going to have carbs. But cocoa butter, if you just eat the cocoa butter, the fat, that has zero carbs and zero protein. So it's 100% fat. So those are a few ways that I like to get fat into my diet. And with that being said, let's talk specifically about what the ketogenic diet is because there are a lot of different opinions on this. And on page 142, she says the ketogenic diet is any way of eating that lowers insulin levels enough to burn fat and generate metabolically meaningful levels of ketones in the blood. And I will tell you from personal experience, this looks different on different people. This looks different depending on what conditions you're dealing with in your body. And so there are a lot of ways to approach a ketogenic diet. And one way I measure ketones is through my Keto Mojo. And another thing you'll have to do while being on this diet is take a lot more electrolytes and probably take more salt than what you're used to. So how does the ketogenic diet improve brain health? And she talks about that on pages 144 to 145. And she says it cools inflammation. So for me personally, because I have an autoimmune issue and chronic inflammation is part of my struggle, when I get into an inflammatory response, I try to go a lot deeper into ketosis because it brings down that inflammation. It also bolsters antioxidant defenses. It partially bypasses defects in damaged mitochondria, and it repairs and replenishes mitochondria. The ketogenic diet also supports neuroplasticity, resolves sensory gating deficits that cause hallucinations, rebalances glutamate, GABA, and other neurotransmitters, stabilizes brain cell networks, lowers sodium levels inside neurons, making them less reactive, and it bridges the brain glucose energy gap. So that's a lot of incredible things that the ketogenic diet does to help improve brain health. And so when I'm talking about the benefits I got from the raw vegan diet, I did get benefits. I did lose weight, just getting off unprocessed foods, getting away from a lot of flour was very beneficial for me. There are some foods that just trigger me more than others. And so that was very helpful. But this is the element that I was missing that I needed because I have always struggled with inflammation, just terrible inflammation. Like when I was running half marathons, if I get tendonitis, there's no coming back from it and it triggers very quickly. And so I have extremely sensitive inflammatory responses. And now we have to come to the part of this series that talks about the safety of a ketogenic diet because a lot of people think it's dangerous. So that's the first criticism that she covers on page 146. And the first criticism that most people say is the ketogenic diet is dangerously low in carbohydrates. The USDA recommends we eat a diet containing 45 to 65% carbs, despite the fact that the human body can make all the glucose it needs from fat and protein. So one could argue that the USDA is dangerously high in carbohydrates. Criticism 2, it's dangerously high in fat. And we've talked about this a little bit in our previous videos. She says the type of fat you eat is more important than the amount. And she discusses this more in chapter 11. She also says public health enemy number 1 is not high-fat dieters. It is high insulin diets, and fat is the macronutrient that raises insulin the least. So remember, we talked about how protein can convert, right? Through gluconeogenesis, you can convert protein to glucose, and you can use that. Sugar, obviously, directly glucose. So all of that raises your insulin. Fat does not raise your insulin. And so it's very interesting that we are so dangerously against fat to the point that we're adding all these extra carbs into our diet and even sometimes protein, right? We have a lot of extremely popular protein shakes out there, protein diets out there, but we're missing something in all of this, and that is the element of fat and looking at fat differently from the standpoint of good fats, unprocessed fats versus processed fats, and toxic oils versus healthy oils. Those are all important conversations to have, and that is really changing the landscape of nutrition. And if you're looking for a lot more research on fats and oils, I would highly recommend Nick Norwitz's channel. He does a lot of great videos on different types of fats. So that brings us to criticism number 3. Being in ketosis is dangerous. So, important note here, this should not be confused with ketoacidosis. Ketoacidosis is not ketosis. And so just a little story here, when I was first starting on this diet and I wanted to see if I had any ketones in my system, I bought those strips from Walmart that you just pee on. And when I got the result, I freaked out because it said, oh my goodness, you're in danger of ketoacidosis. You need to go to the emergency room right away. And so when I looked at those instructions, these strips don't see the differentiation between ketoacidosis and ketosis. So that's one of the things you need to keep in mind. And one of the ways you keep track of that is that you also need to get a glucose monitor. You do need to be checking your sugar. I think that's a great thing for people to be doing. I think it's important for people to know personally how much carbs affect their diet. And I would really encourage you on this diet to check your glucose and ketones on a regular basis, especially as you're just getting started. Ketosis is not ketoacidosis. Your blood sugar will remain stable, and ketosis is actually normal and natural. And just to let you know, my dad is a severe diabetic, type 2 diabetic, and I think he's been on insulin shots for around 15 years. But when he saw the success I was having with the keto diet, he decided to try it. And within 6 to 7 months, he was off all of his medications. His blood sugar was stable. So even though he got down to a point he was eating between, I would say, 10 to 30 carbs a day, his blood sugar remained consistent and healthy and stable. His A1C dropped considerably. So he didn't go into ketoacidosis, and he didn't just jump into 30 or less carbs a day. He started out around 100 carbs and then brought it down slowly because he was on medication. And so he needed to make sure that what he was doing was appropriate for his condition. And this is why the more medications you're on, the more you need to be watched by a doctor who understands this. So we need to make sure that your blood sugar is stable, and we need to see that your ketones are going up. But just because your ketones are going up, that doesn't mean you're going into ketoacidosis. The goal is to stabilize your blood sugar. And so that's just a little story of somebody with type 2 diabetes. Now, type 1 diabetes, I don't have any information really about that. And the ketogenic diet, you're going to have to do some searching on that. But I can tell you for type 2 diabetes that my dad was able to get off all of his medications, and he was over 70 years old when he did this. So you can change how you're eating. You can change the effect, and it doesn't have to be dangerous. We don't want to fall into the trap of these scare tactics that a lot of people like to throw at the ketogenic diet, but at the same time, we don't want to be foolish. We don't want to be ignorant of the dangers either, and this is why you do need to be monitored carefully. Now let's talk about ketogenic diets for specific psychiatric conditions. And on page 147, she says, at the time of this writing, there are clinical trials in the pipeline for anxiety, bipolar disorders, psychosis, substance abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, college mental health, and Alzheimer's disease. However, the ketogenic diet is a powerful metabolic intervention that requires careful planning and medical monitoring. So if you are considering using this approach, please read chapter 18 carefully first to learn how to use this strategy safely. And we've already talked a little bit about that, and we've talked about how it can radically change how you live your life. And on page 154, she says the ketogenic diet rapidly reverses food and mood issues. And you can see results in 2 to 3 days with this. And that's another reason why we need to be careful when starting this diet, because things can change rapidly. And to finish up where we began, let's talk about autism one more time. Let's remind ourselves what's going on in the world of autism and the research on ketogenic diets. Remember, she talked about behavior symptoms and how they improved most in the gluten-free, casein-free group, whereas social, speech, and cognitive symptoms improved most on a ketogenic diet. A common problem seen in autism is that mitochondria are less efficient at turning glucose into energy, partly because of a specific defect in complex 1, the main gateway to the electron transport chain. Ketogenic diets partially bypass that defective area by feeding more fuel molecules directly into complex 2, allowing damaged mitochondria to generate efficiently again. Ketogenic diets also improve the health of existing mitochondria and stimulate the production of new mitochondria. And the more we learn about this, the more we see just how much damaged mitochondria contribute to a lot of our health issues. So if you go down that rabbit hole, you start looking at that on YouTube or on the internet, you're going to see there are a lot of connections there as well. And let's finish up by talking about going beyond ketosis. She says the ketogenic diet supports and stabilizes brain metabolism with ketones, allowing the brain to operate more cleanly, smoothly, and efficiently. But optimal mental health is about more than just ketones. The nutritional quality of your diet matters too. If it's optimal brain health that you seek, you'll need to do more than just energize your brain. You'll need to nourish and protect it as well. And this is where food choices come into play. And I've talked about my experience of doing the ketogenic diet and moving more into carnivore. And now I'm playing around just a little bit by adding different types of fats back into my diet that aren't necessarily strictly carnivore. And so I'm playing around with this diet. There's a lot of room to choose different foods with this diet. And you don't have to give up everything, but yeah, you're going to have to be careful with it and you're going to have to make some choices. And there are a lot of ways to be creative with this diet when you start looking into it more. So that is where we are going to finish this series. We're only covering this much of the book for the series. I just wanted to give you a taste of what this idea is all about, what the research is saying, and how it contradicts everything that we've learned in nutrition so far. I know part of my early childhood degree, I had to take a nutrition class, and this would never get taught in that nutrition class. There isn't a single dietitian in my dad's entire diabetic history that would recommend a diet like this. And yet, here we are, and he had succeeded in getting off all of his insulin. And not only that, his diabetes was so severe, he had to go to a specialist. His normal doctor couldn't handle it. So he had a ton of issues with his diabetes, and his diabetes doctor said he would never be able to get off insulin, but he did. And so I just want to let you know that it is not this scary, bad thing that we've been hearing about, to eat fats and to eat meat and to eat fatty meat, especially. And some of the health foods that we were told were good for us may be doing some harm. Now, in metabolically healthy people and people who aren't struggling with mental illness, maybe you can eat whatever you want. Maybe you can eat bowls of fruit for your lunch. But if you're somebody who is struggling, if you're somebody with a metabolic issue, an autoimmune issue, if you're struggling with mental health, if you're struggling with autism, this might be a path for you. This might be a path forward. And so I would just encourage you to open your mind up, look into this a little bit, and decide whether or not this treatment is right for you or somebody you know. So with that being said, that is all I have for you today. That's all I have for you for this series. If you like what I'm doing here, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, like, share, comment, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.